My name is Dr. Raoul McLaughlin. My subject is ancient peoples beyond the Roman frontiers. The early Roman emperors, for their own security and personal protection, maintained an elite bodyguard of Germanic warriors recruited from territories on the northern frontiers of their empire. This foreign bodyguard was stationed in Rome, but it was not part of the formal Roman army. This unit owed direct and personal allegiance to their commander-in-chief, not to the state, the old nobility, or the influence of high office and hereditary Roman politics. The question is, who were the Germani, Corporis, Custodes? Julius Caesar was the first Roman commander to employ a personal escort of Germanic troops. It was during his conquest of Gaul in the mid-1st century BC. The soldiers were fighters from an allied tribe, elevated to a higher position due to their large physique and proven, respected martial skills. Most importantly, the Germanic warrior code emphasized direct loyalty to their warlords. This force served as a personal bodyguard and fought as a cavalry unit. Caesar recalled how 400 of these select soldiers served him in battle. He describes an incident when Roman troops were sent to take possession of a surrendered Gallic stronghold. They were suddenly surprised by an attack and were in danger of being trapped inside the hostile outpost and slaughtered. They formed up for a desperate retreat towards the gate while it still lay open. But Caesar was ready. He took instant action with the elite horsemen of his personal guard. He reports, Caesar sent to their aid about 400 Germanic horsemen. This was in spite of the fact that he had determined from the onset to keep these men close to himself. Caesar, Gallic War. The Roman soldiers trapped inside the enemy stronghold were saved by this heroic intervention. Following Caesar's example, the first Emperor Augustus also thought it wise to maintain a Germanic guard. These warriors became known as the Germani, Corporis, Custodes. These troops were mainly recruited from the Batavian territories, an ancient tribal group that occupied the Rhine Delta as it flowed into the North Sea, modern Holland. The people lived on the frontier between Gaul and Germany. Several branches of the Rhine separated off the Batavian landmass, thereby forming a distinct territory that ancient people often referred to as an island. In the Imperial era, this region was renowned for its fearsome warriors, and Tacitus reports that the only tribute that the region provided to the empire was by way of levies of fighting men. Batavian recruits formed entire units in the Roman army, and from these select troops, men were chosen for the emperor's personal bodyguard in Rome. The selection method is not known, but the guard may have been valued for their physique, character, or martial skills. Since they came from distant regions, they had no political or personal connections with the elite in Roman society, or other influential groups in the imperial capital. But it wasn't just physical prowess that set these men apart. The ancient Germans had a distinctive martial code that made them ideal as warriors dedicated to a single leader. Above all, each man must seek to avoid being dishonored. The Roman historian Tacitus reports, When the Germans enter battle, it is a disgrace for a chief to be surpassed in valour by any of his retinue. But it is also a disgrace for any man not to equal the bravery of their chief. His followers must defend and protect the chief. They must give him credit for their own deeds of valour. This is the most solemn obligation in their oath of loyalty. The chief fights for victory. His followers fight for their chief. It would mean lifelong infamy and shame to leave a battle alive, especially after the chief has fallen to the enemy. This nation finds in action an unpleasant condition. If their native land stagnates due to a long period of peace and inactivity, their noble youths will deliberately seek out other states who are engaged in some war to win battle honours for themselves. Tacitus, Germania. This may be an idealized account of Germanic warrior culture, but it does suggest the character of the foreign guard who served the Caesars. It seems that when Julius Caesar became dictator, he respected the Senate by not bringing his Germanic guard to political assemblies in Rome. Caesar was murdered on the Ides of March, 44 BC, brutally stabbed and left bleeding to death by his colleagues as he entered a senatorial meeting. His heir Octavian, who inherited his military associations, would not make the same mistake. When Octavian took the name Augustus and accepted the title of emperor in 27 BC, he was protected by a loyal military guard of Germanic warriors, a troop of specially selected soldiers known as the Custodes. On rare occasions, the foreign origin of these troops could present difficulties. For example, in AD 9, Germanic tribesmen ambushed and massacred 3 Roman legions in the Teutoburg forest. During the panic and the volatile political situation that followed, the emperor stood down his German bodyguard. Perhaps their loyalty became suspect, or it was deemed inappropriate for the emperor to be in the presence of men from a nation that had inflicted such a terrible defeat on the legions. However, the Custodes were soon reinstalled, and when Augustus died in AD 14, they transferred their loyalty to his successor Tiberius. The Custodes probably formed a cohort of up to 500 men, with their barracks and headquarters near a site called the Gardens of Dolabella. While in the palace and on public business, the Custodes would have acted as infantry, but they may have been mounted as horse guards for parade duty or on the few occasions when the early emperors appeared on campaign. One example may have been in AD 43, when the Emperor Claudius arrived in southern Britain to complete the initial Roman conquest. Trajan's column in Rome also depicts a fast-moving Germanic infantry unit led by the mounted Emperor Trajan. The Germans are depicted as having large, intimidating physiques and wearing animal skins as the emperor leads them as a strike force against the Dacian enemy. These may be a successor unit of the Custodes, or a regular German unit depicted in a scene to emphasize the heroic character of the emperor on campaign. The Custodes may have adopted the symbols of the imperial household, including eagles, the lightning bolts of Jupiter, or the scorpion birth sign promoted by Tiberius. The Scorpio symbol may have had special resonance for Germanic warriors. According to later attested beliefs, the chief god of the Germans, Woden, rode an 8-legged horse named Sleipnir. Stylized images of Germanic gods and heroes depict figures in strange helmets with twin horn-like protrusions. Mediterranean scorpions must have been an intriguing sight to these men, with their 4 pairs of legs and head-mounted pincers. Scorpions were naturally armoured, and they carried a venomous striking weapon in their sting. This made them an appropriate emblem for spear or lance-equipped ancient cavalry. The German bodyguard was not commanded by a military officer, but led by a personal appointee of the emperor. One of these men was an influential slave named Helicon, who was mentioned by an Alexandrian emissary named Philo. Philo led a Jewish embassy to Rome, but the group had difficulty gaining an audience with the otherwise preoccupied Emperor Caligula. The Alexandrian envoys therefore sought out contacts and identified people who could influence the emperor. Philo describes Helicon as a gymnastics instructor who accompanied Caligula throughout the day and had ample opportunity to hear and influence the emperor's opinions. Philo reports, Helicon fulfills the role of a chamberlain, manager of the royal household, and chief bodyguard, which is an office entrusted only to him. He has all kinds of favourable opportunities for speaking to the emperor at leisure and being listened to when they are distant from outside noise and distractions. Through Helicon, the emperor would be able to quietly hear what we desire. Philo, Embassy to Gaius. But Helicon soon fell from favour, and Caligula placed a former gladiator named Sabinus in charge of his personal security, as head of the Germanic bodyguard. Sabinus was probably a freed slave who had demonstrated his martial skills and valour in the Roman arena. He was possibly from the Thracian class of gladiator, who were armed with a short sword and small shield. These Thracians often fought against the Murillo class of gladiators, who were traditionally equipped with a legionary-style sword and large shield. Perhaps Caligula understood that any assassination attempt would come from politicians and rivals who were trained to attack in the legionary manner. A Thracian swordsman would therefore present an intimidating display of power. Conspirators might wonder what skills and training such an appointee might have shared with the other Custodes. Germanic recruits were probably sent to Rome by trusted governors in the northern provinces, but perhaps the emperors who journeyed to these districts sometimes took the opportunity to personally select or approve recruits. Suetonius reports an incident when Caligula was suddenly reminded of the need to recruit his bodyguard of Batavians and was seized with the idea of an expedition to Germany. So, without delay, he assembled the legions and auxiliaries from all quarters to undertake the task. Suetonius, Life of Caligula. The emperors Augustus and Tiberius both died in old age after suffering from long-term illnesses. But Caligula was not so fortunate, and his political enemies plotted to have the young emperor assassinated. Suetonius describes how conspirators from the Praetorian Guard managed to separate Caligula from his bodyguard of Custodes. A temporary wooden theatre had been constructed on the Palatium grounds for an annual festival presided over by the emperor and senators. The plotters anticipated Caligula's route back to the Imperial palace and ambushed him in a covered passageway. One account suggests that the emperor had paused to speak to some youths from the nobility when a conspirator named Cheria approached from behind. He slashed the emperor's neck, while a tribune named Cornelius Sabinus stabbed him in the chest. However, Tacitus heard a different account of the killing. This version involved more participants, including officers from the Praetorian Guard, who prior to the attack had cleared aside any attendants and onlookers who might interfere with the murder. A tribune then approached the emperor, asking for the password used to identify potential intruders and unauthorized personnel. The emperor asserted his authority by giving the name of the chief god Jupiter. This triggered the attack. Suetonius explains, Cornelius Sabinus dispersed the crowd using centurions who were part of the plot. He then asked the emperor for the watchword, as was the usual military practice. When Caligula replied, Jupiter, Cornelius Sabinus cried, So be it. And as Caligula looked around, Cornelius Sabinus split his jawbone with a blow from his sword. The emperor fell to the ground and with writhing limbs called out that he still lived. But the signal was given. Strike again! And the other soldiers dispatched the emperor with more than 30 wounds. Some even thrust their swords through his groin. Suetonius, Life of Caligula. The Jewish historian Josephus had heard yet another account of the killing. He writes, Cheria met Caligula and asked him for the watchword. Caligula replied with one of his ridiculous words. Socera reproached him, and immediately drew his sword to deliver a formidable strike. But the strike was not a mortal wound. Caligula staggered back with the pain. The stroke of the sword had struck him between the shoulder and the neck, but had not penetrated further because of his collarbone. He was in shock, so he did not cry out or call for any of his friends. Perhaps he had no confidence in them, or perhaps his mind had become disordered. He groaned with the great pain he endured, and he lunged forward in an attempt to flee. But Cornelius Sabinus was ready for this move and shoved Caligula down on his knees. Then many stood around him and struck him repeatedly with their swords. They cried out encouragements to one another to all strike him again. All accounts agree that Aquila delivered the finishing stroke, which finally killed him. Josephus, Jewish Antiquities. Suetonius reports that some of the emperor's litter-bearers tried to intervene using the long poles that they carried with them. These servants were selected for their height and strength, but their improvised weapons were ineffective against the soldiers. The killers may have quickly dispersed, leaving the dismembered body and a crowd of shocked onlookers. When members of the Germanic Guard heard the uproar, they charged through the bystanders to assist their chief and kill those responsible for the violence. Believing the attack had come from the Roman elite, they wrongly killed several senators who had been innocent bystanders to the events. Suetonius confirms. When the disturbance began, Caligula's litter-bearers ran to his aid with their poles. Soon afterwards, members of the Germanic Bodyguard arrived. They killed several of his assassins, but also murdered some inoffensive senators. Suetonius, Life of Caligula. Josephus provides further details on the events immediately after the murder. To avoid interference, the killers had selected a covered passageway for the attack, but this meant that there were few exits from the scene. The narrow approaches had become crowded with many imperial attendants and horrified onlookers. This made rapid escape difficult for men already stained with the blood of the murdered emperor. The brief accounts provided by the sources as to what then followed are open to interpretation. One possibility is that the conspirators sent Roman soldiers into the palace to murder the emperor's unguarded wife and infant daughter. Or perhaps the child was with her father when the attack occurred. Suetonius reports. His wife, Caesonia, was killed with him, being stabbed by a centurion, and his daughter had her brains smashed out against a wall. Suetonius, Life of Caligula. It seems that the German warriors who rushed to defend the imperial family failed to save the child. The Judean king, Herod the Great, had a special bodyguard of Celtic soldiers. So, when Josephus describes the Custodes to his readers, he explains their role by using the term Celtic. Josephus reports, the Germans were the first to perceive that Caligula was slain. These Germans were his personal bodyguard, and they bore the name of the country in which they were recruited. They comprised his so-called Celtic regiment. These men were subject to strong emotions, which is a common trait of the barbarous nations. Likewise, they do not overthink their actions. They have robust physiques and will immediately retaliate when attacked. For this reason, they can perform great exploits. Josephus, Jewish Antiquities. As rumours and confused reports raced through the city, many Custodes knew that some sort of attack had occurred, but they were not certain that the emperor had been slain. Sabinus, the commander of the Custodes, immediately mobilized his men to hunt down the emperor's enemies and would-be assassins. Josephus writes, the Germans drew their swords, and Sabinus led them out. He was one of their tribunes, having received this office, not because his forefathers had performed virtuous actions, but because he had been a gladiator. He had obtained his rank by having a strong physique. Josephus, Jewish Antiquities. His orders were to murder in retaliation, so the Custodes roamed the streets. Any senator they encountered was liable to be killed. A senator named Asprenas had blood from an animal sacrifice on his toga, possibly from some flamingos which had been killed earlier that day. He was immediately surrounded and cut to pieces before he could plead his innocence. Another senator named Norbanus, who was unconnected to the murder, managed to wrestle the sword from a Custodes who had seized him in the street. But this resistance was perceived as guilt, and Norbanus was surrounded by a great number of assailants and killed with a multitude of wounds. A third senator named Antaeus, who hated the emperor, was unconnected with the assassination plot. However, he had an impulsive desire to see the murder site, and when he was spotted in the vicinity, he had to flee. The Custodes pursued him, and though Antaeus managed to hide in his house, he was found and slain. Josephus explains, the house that Antaeus fled to was in chaos, but even though he hid himself, he could not escape the accurate search made by the Germans. They slew those that were guilty, and those who were not guilty, with equal barbarism. Josephus, Jewish Antiquities. The situation escalated when several hundred Germans surrounded the temporary theatre where Caligula had spent the morning watching performances. They suspected that some of the senators and dignitaries present at the venue had been complicit in the assassination plot. Josephus reports. But now a multitude of Germans had surrounded the theatre with their swords drawn. All the occupants expected death and were seized by fear as the troops entered the venue. It seemed that those present might be immediately cut to pieces. The crowd became distressed, but no one had the courage to leave the theatre. On the other hand, no one thought they were safe remaining. When the Germans drew near, the noise of cries was so great that the entire theatre resounded with entreaties that the spectators made to the troops. They pleaded that they were entirely ignorant of all seditious contrivances. They knew nothing of any plot, and they begged to be spared. Josephus, Jewish Antiquities. This tense standoff was resolved when a market crier named Aruntius was instructed to accompany the tribunes and declaim the Custodes in his loud voice that Caligula had indeed been killed. Josephus explains, the Germans had engaged in all forms of violence while they believed that Caligula still lived. They had such loyalty for him that they would have willingly given their own lives to thwart a plot against him and ensure his escape from such a pitiful fate. But the rage they felt to punish his enemies had abated when they realized that Caligula was already dead. It was now a vain act for them to show their zeal and loyalty to him. The person who would reward them for these acts had perished. Josephus, Jewish Antiquities. The succeeding Emperor Claudius attained power with the support of the Praetorian Guard. Consequently, he may have downplayed the significance of the Germanic Custodes, particularly at ceremonial events. However, the Custodes returned to prominence under the reign of the young Emperor Nero, who came to power due to the contrivance of his mother Agrippina. One of the early indications that Nero was asserting his own authority was his decision to remove his mother's guard of Germanic troops and Praetorian soldiers. Suetonius confirms that Nero deprived her of all her political honours, including her guard of Roman and Germanic soldiers. Then he forbade her to live in his company and excluded her from the palace. Suetonius, Life of Nero. The complex identity of these Germanic warriors is confirmed by surviving inscriptions. The troops were ethnically Germanic, but in Roman society they could adopt Celtic, Latin, or even Greek names. A funeral inscription refers to a Custodes known by the Celtic name Indus. The text reads, Indus, bodyguard of Nero, Claudius, Caesar, Augustus, of the second Decuria, of the Batavian nation, who lived 36 years, is buried here. The gravestone was erected by his brother and heir, Eumenes, from the collegium of the Germanic tribesmen. This demonstrates how Rome could culturally absorb people from northern nations. In AD 65, Nero learnt of an assassination plot involving members of the senior nobility, the Senate, and the Praetorian Guard. He responded by bringing numerous military units into the vicinity of Rome. These detachments were assumed to be loyal to the establishment and unconnected with the existing conspiracy. They could be called upon to provide military protection and arrange arrests when necessary. The Germanic troops of the Custodes possibly played a major role in this scheme, Tacitus reports. There was an incessant and rapid movement of soldiers through public lands, private grounds, rural fields, and the villages neighbouring Rome. The troops included cavalry and infantry intermixed with Germans, who the emperor trusted because they were foreigners. Tacitus, Annals. On this occasion, the conspiracy failed. The plotters who planned to murder Nero were successfully arrested, executed, or forced to commit suicide. But Nero held power for only 4 more years. In AD 68, uprisings began in northern Gaul that required large opposing armies to be mobilized. Perhaps imperial advisors counseled the emperor that he should not appear in the presence of northern barbarians at this time of conflict. The Germanic Guard may have been quietly stood down, leaving Nero entirely dependent on his Praetorians. Meanwhile, Galba, the governor of Hispania Tarraconensis, declared himself emperor and marshalled his military forces against Nero. During this political crisis, the prefects of the Praetorian Guard in Rome withdrew their public support, suddenly isolating the emperor. Suetonius reports. The emperor panicked when he discovered that many of his former supporters and attendees had left his presence and were refusing all summons. He therefore fled to a villa on the outskirts of the city, where he committed suicide. Suetonius, Life of Galba. When the newly proclaimed Emperor Galba seized Rome, he is reported to have disbanded the Germanic Guard due to their loyalty to the previous regime. Suetonius writes, Galba also disbanded Nero's German guards, who had served several previous emperors and proved consistently loyal. They were repatriated without a bounty. Suetonius, Life of Galba. Nero was the last emperor of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Perhaps, if he had trusted his Custodes, they would have fought as fiercely for his preservation as they did for his predecessor Claudius. The emperor and his dynasty might have been saved by the confidence and loyalty of these few dedicated troops. But with their emperor dead and his family line destroyed, the German warriors accepted their fate and quietly returned to their northern homelands. Thank you for your attention.